Mr. Shively here, getting ready to read to you The Old Woman and the Jar of Ums. Once upon a time in the woods, a little old woman was picking blackberries to make jam. Reaching for a specially juicy berry, she spied a funny-looking jar. It was green glass with red and brown swirls, and it was bent in the middle like somebody had kicked it. "Pick me up," the jar said. "This is a mighty friendly little jar," the old woman said. She picked it up, and it looked to be empty. She shook it. Nothing come out. She looked in it. Nothing there. So she took it home, wiped it out, and filled it up with sugar. Then she commenced to making her jam. She set some blackberries to boil in her big old pot. "Pick me up," said the jar. She picked up the jar and put a shake of sugar into the jam. Just as she set the jar down, "Pick me up," it said again. And she picked up the jar and put more and more sugar into the jam. Seemed like every time she set the jar down, it said, "Pick me up," till she had poured all the sugar out of the jar into the jam. "Why, this jam has twice as much sugar as regular jam," she said. She put her spoon into the bubbling pot and tasted it. She said. That's fine." The jar got ready, and she made her biscuits and set the table. She set it for two, 'cause Jackie McPhee was on his way over. Jackie McPhee was the meanest, orniest boy in the woods. He had fiery red hair and wild-looking brown eyes and a streak of mischief in him that drove everybody crazy. "Rotten eggs," he'd yell, and then one would land on your porch. The little old woman was mighty tired of his tricks. She got his folks to send him over for tea and the biggest talking to of his life. She knew when he got there because she heard "rotten eggs," and she poked her head out of the door and looked around. "Rotten eggs!" There was a smelly old rotten egg about to land on her porch. She was sure of it. She grabbed her broom and started shaking it. Don't. Aw, I was just funning you," said Jackie McPhee, stepping out from behind the bush where he'd been hiding. He was all dressed up in his Sunday best. His hair was slicked back, and he was clean as a whistle. Of course, he'd brought some rotten eggs with him and a toad to put in the teapot, but she didn't know that. Come in and, sit down," said the little old woman. Then she thought, "I don't generally stammer like this. What's the matter with me?" But she couldn't seem to stop saying, While the boy was getting settled, she refilled the funny-looking jar with sugar and set it on the table. Then she gave Jackie some sassafras tea. Soon as he had the cup in his hand, "Pick me up," said the funny-looking jar. Jackie was so surprised he dropped his toad to the floor, where it went hopping away. He picked up the jar and put a spoonful of sugar in his tea. He said, "That's good." Then the jar said, "Pick me up," again. Every time Jackie thought he was through with the sugar, the jar said, "Pick me up," till he had 14 spoonfuls of sugar in his tea. Finally, he set the jar down, and it was quiet. He started gulping his tea and stuffing jammy biscuits in his mouth with both hands. Pretty soon, he asked the old woman if he could, have another biscuit with jam. He'd already had 4. She said, I reckon, and then she started to give him a talking to. "Jackie McPhee," she wanted to say, but all that come out was ummy She tried again. "Rotten ums," she said. He said. "Rotten ums." The little old woman and Jackie McPhee stared at each other. Why was they both saying To clear their throats, the little old woman poured them more and more tea and the funny-looking jar said, "Pick me up," lots more times, so they put all the sugar from the jar into their tea and drunk it down. The more they drunk, the ummier they got, till finally they was just ummin' to each other and couldn't say no words at all. "Ummy, said the old woman, getting red in the face. "Ummy, said Jackie McPhee, putting down his teacup and looking at the old woman like she'd poisoned him. Something powerful strange was happening. The old woman looked at Jackie McPhee. He looked at her. Then they both looked at the funny-looking jar. "Pick me up," it said. The old woman went over and picked it up. She turned it upside down. On the bottom was written a message: "Caution, hainted jar. Drinking or eating out of this here jar will make you say P.S. It don't wear off." They had been eating sugar out of the magic jar all day long. No wonder they couldn't talk. She and Jackie McPhee were in big trouble. The boy puckered up his face and looked like he was going to cry. The old woman sat down in the rocking chair and rocked herself back and forth. What was they going to do? There must be somebody who could help them. Then it struck her. There was only one person in the world who could help. It was the willy-nilly man. Now, if you don't know, the willy-nilly man is scary. He got a beard that goes all the way down to his knees, and spiders live in there, and worms, and little blobs of grease, and food he's eaten kind of hang all over it. And his eyes is scary. One of them looks one way, and the other one looks the other way, so you can't tell exactly where he's looking. He got one big, long black tooth, and he never washes himself. But he knows just about all the magic there is to know. If anybody could stop the ums, it was him. The old woman put on her shawl and tried to tell Jackie McPhee where they was going. She said, pointing out the door, and meaning willy-nilly man. Jackie McPhee didn't understand what the little old woman was umming about. If he had have understood, he would have flat refused to go. Jackie was mean, and he was ornery. But like all children in the woods, there's one thing he was plumb scared of, and that's the willy-nilly man. See, if in the willy-nilly man don't like you, he can just up and change you to a fat sow bug or a slimy old worm. So it's probably just as well the little old woman couldn't tell Jackie McPhee where they was going. She started umming at him. She ummed him out the door all right, but then she just couldn't seem to get him moving. He was looking mighty scared, and he kept trying to run, and finally she had to grab him by the back of the collar, put him in her old wheelbarrow, and push him along. Just as they was leaving the house, "Pick me up," said the jar, and the little woman picked it up and put it in the wheelbarrow on top of Jackie McPhee. Jackie McPhee didn't like it in the wheelbarrow. They was a bumpity-bumping through the woods so hard his teeth began to rattle. Finally he got so upset he started to cry. The old woman stopped the wheelbarrow and put her red shawl on him to make him feel better. He quit crying, but he rolled himself up in a little ball and snuggled on down under the shawl till she couldn't hardly even see him. She didn't know if this was good or bad, but she just let him be, 'cause there, right in front of him, was the clearing where the willy-nilly man lived. Now, the willy-nilly man's house is scary. It's all tacked up out of cardboard and tin cans and things what other folks don't want. There's a cow skull where most folks have a winder, and trash heaped up where most folks have a garden. There's a couple of skinny old dogs slinking around looking mean, but none of that was half as scary as the willy-nilly man hisself. He was sitting in the middle of the clearing, beating on his magic drum, singing, "Dogs, scratch yourselves, dogs, scratch yourselves." And his old dogs was rolling around and around on the ground, scritching and scratching, till like to scratch their own ears off. That ain't the worst. After the dogs had a good scritch and scratch, the willy-nilly man beat his drum again and sung, "Jar, show yourself. Jar, show yourself." At first the old woman thought maybe he was just singing about any old jar, but then that magic jar she had in her hand began to itching and tingling. It didn't say pick me up, though, most likely 'cause she was already holding it. "Jar, show yourself. Jar, show yourself." The willy-nilly man left off drumming. "Come here, you old jar. Where are you? I knowed you was here this morning." Course, what he didn't know, nor the old woman neither, was that the jar had said pick me up to the dogs, and one of 'em had picked it up in his mouth and carried it off to the bushes, where the old woman found it. "Jar, show yourself." The willy-nilly man started up his drumming again. The little old woman didn't know what to do. If she stepped forward with the jar, the willy-nilly man might be glad to help her 'cause she was the one bringing his jar back. On the other hand, what if the willy-nilly man was mad because she had his jar to begin with? "Jar, show yourself." The old woman's hand that was holding the jar just kind of moved forward into the clearing by itself and drug her along behind, pushing the wheelbarrow. "Well, looky here," said the willy-nilly man. "See who brought my jar home to me. Where'd you get it, old woman?" The little old woman didn't say nothing. She just put the jar down on the ground and kind of backed up. How was she going to ask him for help? "Pick me up," said the jar. The willy-nilly man picked up the jar. "Well, old woman, speak up. I can't hear you. Where'd you get it?" The little old woman cleared her throat. She wanted to explain, but no words come out. "So you been using it, have you? Who said you could do that? And where'd you get it?" he asked again, real mad. "Did you steal it?" The willy-nilly man was standing right next to her now. She was close enough to see the spiders in his beard and point on his tooth, and she was pretty near petrified. "You ought to know better than to steal from me. The onlyest man to ever steal from me ended up as a crawdaddy with eyes sticking out on stalks and long scaly legs." The old woman tried to think of a way to explain to the willy-nilly man that she hadn't stolen his jar. She just found it on the ground in the woods. She hadn't meant no harm by picking it up, and anyways, how was she to know it belonged to him? "This jar has got a powerful juju magic on it," said the willy-nilly man. "Ain't nobody knows how to mess with juju magic but me." He set down his drum again. "Maybe I'll just turn you into a crawdaddy. Serve you right for stealing my jar." Now, a crawdaddy, if you don't know, is a little crab-like thing that lives in the river. It's the ugliest thing alive. The willy-nilly man set to drumming. "Legs, stretch yourselves. Legs, stretch yourselves," he sang at the old woman's legs, and she could feel her knees itching to stretch themselves out into crawdaddy legs, and her feet trying to get all scaly. She was so scared she hoped first on one foot and then on the other. She kind of hoped that the willy-nilly man wouldn't notice the wheelbarrow of Jackie McPhee all covered up by her red shawl. No use in both her and the boy turning into crawdaddies. Suddenly, out from under the shawl come a terrible sound. The shawl seemed to be moaning and wiggling around all by itself. The willy-nilly man stopped drumming. The willy-nilly man said, "What you got here?" Just then, Jackie McPhee, still all covered up by the shawl, raised up a little and hollered, meaning rotten eggs. And then he threw 2 rotten eggs at the willy-nilly man. Sploosh, sploosh. The stink was awful. Now, the willy-nilly man ain't like most folks. He don't mind rotten eggs theirselves. In fact, he eats 'em for breakfast every morning. But having rotten eggs pitched at him from a moaning, wiggling shawl was just too much. "You got a magic juju shawl," he hollered. "How's I to know you had a juju magic too? Don't let that juju shawl get me. Don't let it," he yelled, and he commenced to shaking in his shoes and backing away from the wheelbarrow. "Pick me up," said the jar of and the little old woman picked it up and shook it in the willy-nilly man's face. Seeing him so scared over a little boy covered by a shawl had give her back her gumption. "Ummy, she shouted at him in her fiercest voice. All right, old woman. Don't make no, never mind. You can have the jar. Take it. Just get that shawl thing out of here before it throws something else at me." Said the old woman again, meaning, how do I stop saying "Suck on a pine needle and then drink clean water out of the jar," said the willy-nilly man, backing up into his house. "You'll be all right." The little woman hightailed it home, pushing that wheelbarrow. There was plenty of pine needles around, and she and Jackie McPhee sucked on 'em for quite a while before either of 'em felt like talking again. Then they drank some clean water out of the jar. "Well, boy," said the old woman, "I reckon you know when you can play a trick and when you can't." "Yes, ma'am," said Jackie McPhee, real polite. "No more rotten eggs on my porch. No, ma'am. Cross my heart and hope to spit." Then the old woman got a twinkle in her eyes. "I don't suppose you could use a thing like this," she said, looking at the funny jar of "Pick me up," said the jar. "Go ahead," the little woman said. "Take it home. You've earned it." Well, the little old woman had just made herself a friend for life. Jackie McPhee grinned a huge, gap-toothy grin, picked up that jar, and danced out of them woods. Happiest little boy in the world, thinking how he was going to set his teachers, his folks, and everybody else to saying whenever he pleased. The little old woman waved goodbye, then tottered off into the kitchen. It was a shame to lose that batch of blackberry jam, but she had to throw it all out. And that is the story of the old woman and the jar of ums.